Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Allison Zepkavering. I'm a MICE staff member, and I wanted to welcome you to today's event, A Conversation with Nate Stevenson. I had a few acknowledgments before we start. Thank you to our host, Boston University and BU's Visual Narrative Program. Thank you as well to the Lee Q Family Foundation for supporting free admission to MICE. MICE is a member festival of the Boston Comic Arts Foundation, and you can discover more amazing comic events at bostoncomicarts.org. Today's interviewer is Brigid Alverson, a prominent and longtime comics journalist, critic, and editor who has extensively covered manga, graphic novels, and digital comics. She's known for her editorial work with School Library Journal and for her contributions to websites like ICV2 and Publishers Weekly. Welcome, Brigid.
Thank you. And I am honored to be here. And I'm especially happy to be interviewing Nate Stevenson, whose work I've been following for a long time. Nate Stevenson is the creator of Nimona, which came out in 2015 and was nominated for a National Book Award that year. It's also a hell of a read. He was part of the team that co-created Lumberjanes at Boom Studios and wrote a number of other comics, including Thor for some little place called Marvel. Before turning to Hollywood, where he was the creator and executive producer of the animated series She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. Yes. And co-producer of the animated adaptation of Nimona. Along the way, your work appears to be popular here. Along the way, he found time to write an illustrated memoir, The Fire Never Goes Out, and a webcomic, I'm Fine, I'm Fine. And in September, his illustrated prose novel, Scarlet Morning, was published. So please welcome Nate Stevenson.
Hello, thank you for being here, everybody.
Okay, so the first thing, always, is to talk about the new book. So tell us a little bit about Scarlet Morning.
So Scarlet Morning was actually a book that I started when I was a pretty young teenager. I read Aragon, and I was like, if this guy could do it, I could do it. So I was like, I'm going to finish the book before I turn 15, and then I'm going to get published, I'll be famous, and have $1 billion.
You know, that doesn't happen to most people, but it seems to have worked out well for you.
So I did finish it. It was 600 pages by the time I had finished it. And I put it in this big binder, and I was just like, you know, all right, where do editors hang out? Like, where do they go? How can I get them to, like, read this and give me, you know, my $1 billion? So that didn't happen. But I ended up, you know, at first I was like, all right, writing isn't happening. Let's leave that dream behind. And then I accidentally stumbled into comics. It was the only class open, and I didn't expect to get, like, completely bowled over by how much I fell in love with comics. And so I ended up actually, you know, moving towards Nimona, and that ended up being my first published work, which was just totally unexpected. But I never forgot about this original story. Like, my first baby is like these characters that have lived in my head in some form since I was like 9 or 10. And so a couple years ago, it was during the pandemic, and my job on She-Ra came to a close when the final season came out, at the same time that the pandemic first hit. So, no job, can't leave the house, meltdown. And so I really was like struggling to kind of like find my creative voice again, or find something I was excited about. And so I went back to what had been my first love, and it was this book. So yeah, 5 years later, it finally came out. I'm just so happy that it finally is out there in the world, that people can kind of like get to know these characters in this world. It represents so much. of my life and my interests and stories that I would like to see more of, mostly just, hot lady pirates. I just need a lot of those. Yeah, and here we are.
So I assume that many of us in this room are creatives of some sort, and perhaps we've all had the experience of looking back at something we did 5 or 10 years ago and having emotions. How did you feel when you first looked back at that book, and then how did it evolve in the 5 years between then and now?
I was really nervous to crack it open again and take another look, just because I had so many fond memories. It wasn't even just a book; it had been like this. I was emailing the chapters to my friends and getting their feedback, and then playing as the characters on the playground with my siblings. It was just such a big part of my life, and I was like, if I read it and it's bad, I will cry a lot. And then I started reading it, and I was like, okay, yes, it's obvious that a teenager wrote this at times, but then I was also like, oh, this still works for me. There were parts I'm like, that's a cool idea. I didn't remember doing that. So I did feel, well, I knew there was a lot of work to do, and there did end up being a lot of work to do. I was like, there's something real here that I could really get into again. And so it was actually a really positive experience to kind of revisit this world. It's like in Narnia, where they live a whole life in this world. They fall back through the wardrobe. It's only been an afternoon. And then they end up in it again later, and they're like, how could we have forgotten this? That's what it felt like. It felt like this place that I had lived, and this family that I had lived with, and suddenly I was like, they're still here. How could I have forgotten this? But yeah, like I said, there was a lot of work to do. It was, I had a lot of new ideas. I think the whole the world building was what I was really excited to get into, because it was a very kind of standard, like a little bit of fantasy, but a more straightforward, Age of Sail, vaguely Victorian at times. I just really wanted to make it my own and make it something really unique. So that was sort of where my first priority. And then, like I said, I was stuck inside, so I really wanted to I wanted to pretend that I was traveling through some kind of remarkable landscape, seeing really beautiful things, when all I was really looking at were my walls. And so that was sort of where I started. I just wanted to bring a new version of this world to life.
And did it ever occur to you to do it as a comic as opposed to an illustrated novel? And at what point did the illustrations come into it, actually?
Yeah, my first instinct was to try to reimagine it as a comic. I have half of a proposal written where it is a comic, but I found myself really struggling to execute that story as a comic. It was just like I said, it was 600 pages, so it's very, very dense. In comics, that would have ended up being maybe twice as many pages to cover the same amount. And so the only way to do that would be to cut a lot of it, which I could have done, but I just felt in the process that it stopped feeling like what it was. I was still zeroing in on what this book was, but I could tell what it wasn't. That was the first thing I knew. I was like, if I do this, I might as well just come up with a new thing, because it's not going to be the book that I originally set out to do. And the other, I put off doing that not only because I love comics, but because I was so scared of trying to learn how to write prose again. And it was really difficult. Prose is its own, totally own beast. And after working in visual media, you have to learn a whole new toolbox of tricks, of skills, of all of it. And that really intimidated me. But ultimately, it just felt like that was what the story was, and I had to stay true to that if I was going to do it. But at the same time, I am an illustrator. I think the quickest way for me into any character is the visual, is the art. And you can accomplish so much in just drawing two characters standing next to each other. Something that would take, so much more real estate to really dig into, but in a second when you see that character, the way they hold themselves, the way they're looking at the other character, so much about them. And so I always knew I was drawing and I was writing at the same time, and I always knew that this was going to be, they were going to go hand in hand. And I was really inspired by some of my favorite illustrated middle grade books from when I was a kid, like The Phantom Toll Booth or Harriet the Spy or By the Great Horn Spoon. Those had actually been, they felt like my first exposure to comics before I was really reading them. And so I really wanted to try and do what they did, where the text and the images are interwoven and they ping off of each other. It's not just here's an image of what you're reading. It's they are interacting. You're absorbing both of them at the same time.
So, and to talk about the world of Scarlet Morning for a minute, like that's a very distinct world from our own, and there's a lot to it. So always the challenge in prose is to bring the reader into that world without drowning them in description. And the joy of comics is that you can do that, as you say, with characters. You can do it with an image. How did you develop that world? Was it part? Sounds like it wasn't part of the original book. And how did you manage to make it present for the reader? Like, what were you thinking about? What conscious things did you do to immerse the reader into that world?
Yeah, like I said, the original setting, it did have fantasy aspects. It did have this kind of weird slapdash, like all lost things have sort of coalesced here, which was part of what I found fascinating about it. At that time, and even more so now, I was thinking a lot about the nature of lost things and how we're kind of stewing in them all the time. Like the world we move through is a graveyard of other people's dreams and ambitions and creations, and we're only really aware of the small sliver that we occupy at any given time. But as I've gotten older, I've gotten more interested in just like, looking at the sidewalk I'm walking on and being like, what fossils ended up being ground up in this sidewalk? And so I really wanted to take that idea and expand that. And so the idea that I came up with, because I read this book about salt, it was called Salt. And it was all about, it's sort of this really condensed history of the world through salt, fittingly enough. And salt is this thing that's really, really interesting. It's the only rock we need to survive. And it both preserves but also corrodes. And so I found that idea specifically really interesting, that it was something that both was sort of eating away and also like entombing and protecting and prolonging the existence of certain things. And so I decided that this world was a place that had been, this ocean that tied this whole world together had been turned into a desert of salt. And this salt is sort of creeping and consuming the rest of the world like a little bit at a time. And I'm really into like Arctic exploration stories and mountaineering stories. I like reading about people having a bad time in cold places.
Awesome, me too.
Yeah. And it's really, really striking because it's so hostile. It's so not built around the existence of people and their ambitions. And so I really wanted to kind of show this, what looked like this frozen tundra. But then you see these two kids and they're barefoot in short sleeves and they're just walking through what looks like snow and ice, and I found that a really cool visual. And also when it came to making this world feel big, one of the things I've always struggled with is kind of setting and landscape, but never comes out as epic and beautiful as I see it in my head. And so having it all be white, I wanted to use like the white of the page and have the characters be navigating, like this is what it looks like. You see someone climbing Everest and they're just this little speck, this red and yellow speck against just, it looks like blank paper sometimes when the sun hits it. And so, yeah, I really wanted to try and like, not just have the drawings and the text, but the sort of invisible world in between those two things be informed by the physical object that the reader was holding in their hands. Yeah, so that's where the idea of a lot of like the world building changes, that was where those were coming from.
That's so cool. I think I would love to see you sit down and talk to Scott McCloud about this, because as you're talking about the invisible space between the pictures and the words, I'm thinking of like what happens in the gutters, and you're bringing a whole new dimension to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that like this switch to prose is like, I did talk about this with Scott the other night, and I was like talking about this. He's like, I'm so disappointed that you moved to prose. I'm like, I'm sorry.
Oh no, you've disappointed Scott McCloud.
I know.
Life will never be the same.
Yeah, and I mean, his books were the reason that I got into comics in the first place, you know, not just learning the craft of what makes comics what they are, but also what comics have been and what they are now and what they could be. It's both the oldest medium in the world and also one that we've barely scratched the surface on. So honestly, when it comes to prose, I'm having a lot of fun playing in the negative space of prose as well. That's so much more a contract with the reader and trying to build an image in their head and not go against the image that they have in their head. But like also like I'm coming to that with a comics perspective. And so even like the ways that like I played a lot with just the way the text even without the illustrations, moves across the page. There's like one passage where the characters are separated. They're in this sort of like snowstorm of salt. And the main character can hear the other character shouting for her, but her voice is really muffled. And so you see the quotation marks and you see the punctuation, but you don't see any of the letters that the character's shouting. You just see these like empty quotes, which is kind of how it sounds. And you can sort of like hear someone, but all you can hear is that kind of like muffled buzz of their voice. So just trying to like use the text in a visual way wherever I could.
When you are thinking about a story and preparing to tell it, do you see it in your head like a movie? Like, whenever I ask people who do both, they very often say, both prose and comics, they say, oh yes, I see it like a movie in my head. You've done movies too, well, animation. So you've got all these different storytelling modes. How does that inform the way that you tell a story? And do you think prose is going to affect your comics, should you ever choose to do comics again?
Yeah, I am so interested on this topic. I feel like I could talk about it forever, because I have gotten the privilege to be able to play in a lot of different fields and industries. And so I think when I started out, when I was writing the first draft of Scarlet Morning, I was a voracious reader and a huge lover of movies. You know, the hometown where I grew up in, as a kid, I was like, this place is so boring, oh my God. And so I went to movies like all the time. That was my favorite thing to do. It was so magical, this way of being transported. It's, you know, South Carolina, and it's, you know, just 97% humidity, and you can't go outside for 6 months out of the year. And so these like dark, air-conditioned, smelling of like stale popcorn, these places became this magical mode of time travel and teleportation. And so, but I was also reading like nonstop, and I was a speed reader. So I would inhale these books and okay, I get the idea of what's on that page, on to the next. So like, I think I was at that time describing a movie that was playing out in my head when I wrote that first draft. And that kind of led me, I think there was something so interesting about getting into comics, because comics really becomes more about what does a line hold? Like, this is a dot. Like, I draw dot eyes and a simple slash for a mouth, and I rarely draw noses. It's very simplified. But what can you say when a character, when they have that little line appear under one eye, you know they're going through it. So what does that line say? A simple little, and if you draw it at this angle, long or short, light touch or a heavy hand, that changes the meaning, and the reader knows instinctively what you're trying to say. And so that is what becomes, like, I started to move away from the movie when I started doing comics. In some ways, it still was sort of following the reel, and trying to capture the characters acting, because they're the actors, and also I'm the actor. But I was so fascinated by what goes unsaid and how a small mark can say so much. And I followed that into animation, which I think I was way more out of my depth when it came to animation. The study of movement and the study of like the character moving through a three-dimensional space. I've always really struggled with three-dimensional space. And so I was always trying to chase these sort of like more skilled animators when it came to animation, and just like fascinated, just studying them. And so when it comes to prose is this place that is like, the invisible holds so much. It was a total reprogramming, a complete, just like, let's go back to square A, because like, I can't even go back to what I was writing as a teenager, because that's not enough for me anymore. I need to know why prose does what it does. And you have all these new dimensions that you wouldn't otherwise have in any of these visual mediums. I never had smell, touch, taste, like being inside the character's head. It was so intimidating. You have like so much at your disposal. The only limit is what you can pull off. And it took me 4 drafts, I think, to get anywhere near what I wanted to say, because you have to really you have to pare it down. Again, it's that contract with a reader that you don't know, trying to get them to take in an environment, take in what a character knows and what they don't know, what they're trying not to know, all of those things. It was so many new dimensions I'd never worked with before. So yeah, I do think it has changed my relationship to comics. I'm far from done with comics, but I do find them getting wordier and wordier. The illustrations getting fewer and farther between. But I really don't want to like leave any of these worlds behind. I'm so fascinated by what they contain and the different things that are possible with them.
And to look at the full possibilities here, I mean, you have almost two different modes. Because there's the fantasy storytelling of Nimona and Scarlet Morning, where you're immersed in a whole different world, and there are fantastical characters and magic occurs. And then you've also done a memoir and your online comic, which is very, very slice of life, very modern day. Sometimes almost reads like poetry, but has a very different grounding. Why do you have these two different modes? And do you think like certain stories work better? Do you feel like sometimes fantasy can get closer to truth than a slice of life comic? Like, how do you work on those two different levels? It's kind of mind-boggling. Usually people are good at one or the other.
That's a really good question, and my answer is less good because I don't know. When I look back, I think it's pretty obvious to me that comics saved my life in a pretty literal way. When I ended up out in the world on my own at 17 and I was going to art school and I just found the cord cut really quickly because of the things that were going on in my life and in my family. It was pretty immediate that I was just, out in the world. And my views started changing very quickly. I'd been raised in a very sheltered, homeschooled, evangelical, conservative, pretty extreme environment on all of those fronts. And suddenly, I was like, wow, I can't believe I'm this straight person and I'm friends with all gay people. What are the odds? But during that process, I ended up changing my mind on pretty much every strongly held belief that I had. And it was really scary. It was extremely destabilizing, and I felt completely thrown out into space, going from being like an ant in an ant farm with a loving father figure who was going to make sure that nothing really bad ever happens to me, to being aware for the first time that I am drifting in an infinite space that goes on in every direction. I was terrified of just existing. And I didn't know what story I was going to live, and I didn't know if there was a story. I didn't know how to find that, and comics gave me a way of finding that. So in figuring out what little cartoon character I could be that could stand in for me, that was where I started making sense of the life that I was living. And building my internet following was something that it cut through the loneliness and let me kind of have that presence that I had just lost, in the presence of a loving God that had lived in my head my whole life. It was something that made me feel less alone. I could sort of turn my life into these vignettes that didn't conquer my fears. It didn't turn my life more simple, but it gave me a way of processing them at a time where therapy was way in the future. That was not a thing that I thought I could do. And I still sort of treat it that way. I have to think of it as just processing, whether it's a funny thing that happened to me and I don't want to forget it, or if it's I don't even know what these feelings are. How can I kind of put faces to them and explore them through this magical medium of words and pictures? And I just try to follow what that urge is, what I need out of it at that time. I'm not very good at just forcing myself to create something that I'm not feeling. So yeah, I think for me it is very fluid, but it is just a way of processing the input that I'm getting and how that interacts with what I'm feeling, because that can be so hard to figure out otherwise.
Absolutely. You're making me think of a scene early on in Scarlet Morning where these two children who have lived in this very, metaphorically and physically dark place where everything is just kind of gray and restrained, and they get on a boat and they come up the next morning and they think the ship is on fire because there's the sun, it's blazing, and they've never seen anything like it before. And I kind of, when I was reading that, I was thinking, knowing that your background, it must have been a little bit like that, to sort of emerge into this whole huge, confusing, scary world. Definitely,
and I think I must have done that on purpose, but I feel like hearing you say that just now, I'm like, oh yeah. And like I said, this was based on this story that I was writing while I was there. This idea of these kids being sort of stranded in this place that is, it's horrible in how vacant it is. And like that was, I don't think that that is the truth of like, that was how I felt, I think, living in this very, very sheltered, very, very cloistered existence. And even the sort of eeriness of like, we had, the homeschoolers would meet once a week wherever we could and have classes that our parents would teach. And a lot of that was held in mega churches, like on the off days. So I spent a lot of time kind of moving through these massive, impossibly huge, like beige spaces with like these weird hallways that went nowhere. And suddenly you'd be on a balcony and just like really enjoying like kind of exploring these places, but also feeling completely out of place and feeling like there was nothing here for me. So yeah, I think that those characters, I think that that came very much from my feelings at that time before I had kind of like found my way to the world that I think even as a young kid, I was missing the absence of and didn't know how to find.
I'm now thinking of a really interesting counterfactual where if you had been raised Catholic. Because I
was jealous of the Catholics. I was like, I wish I could go and confess. Like that would, if there's like a thing I could do, that sounds better.
Like I grew up in a huge, confusingly designed church too, but there were paintings on every surface, and you know.
That sounds cooler.
Would have been a lot bloodier, I think. You also, like, I remember watching you at 10 years ago when Nimona came out, and hearing your story of like signing the contract with HarperCollins when you were still in college, totally feeling like an underachiever. I still feel like an underachiever. You were very young, and even like before that, you were doing freelance work. So like you started as a professional cartoonist and artist. It's like you skipped the whole years of starving and self-doubt. But what was that like for you? So you were very young when you went into this system, and like now, 10 years later, how do you feel? What advantages and disadvantages did that give you? And again, it always comes down to how does it shape your storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, the years of starvation and doubt were there. Just, fortunately for me, like very condensed into a few years. And I was privileged to find work, but it was also a necessity. I did find myself kind of cut off before I was ready. It was like, first it was fan art and it was Tumblr. And, I was able to kind of like make these illustrations that were easy enough. I would go to the Kinko's and print them out for $1.50 on cardstock, and then I could, sell that and mail it to somebody and sell that for 15, 20 bucks. And that was how I was paying rent. That's how I was buying food. And so that was sort of, it was a necessity. And I was also just very fortunate that that was enough for me to pay those bills. I didn't have to take on multiple other jobs as so many other people have to do at the same time. But it was something that did, I think, the fact that it started with fan art, and so that it had that kind of obvious appeal. It was sort of more easy for people to be like, oh, I know that character. I like that character. I want to own a picture of that character. And then, being at art school, having my friends pushing me and being like, I know you want to create your own characters, not just draw other people's. So, it was my friend Ames being like, I challenge you to do that. I challenge you to make 2 pages of a comic with your own characters. And those were the first 2 pages of Nimona. And so I just felt so fortunate.
I hope you bought Ames a drink later.
Yeah. I felt so fortunate to be in the right place at the right time, to be surrounded by the right people, and to sort of find my niche online the way I did. And now online has changed so much. It's a whole different game. No one else can do what I did. They have to, find a new way through. But yeah, I do think, while I feel so fortunate, it also is, I don't know, it's strange. It's an interesting path to walk, because I do feel that it also is like, I love being here. I love being among my peers. Like, I just want to I want to obsess over this craft and just be on the ground with all the other artists. And so the ability to do that is so amazing. I've definitely gone through these periods of burnout and just intense anxiety where I find that difficult to do. I am only in, like, I think the last 2 years starting to emerge out of that. It does catch up with you, I think, at times, and you sort of find yourself, like, knocked on your ass and just being like, okay, like, I have to sort of like hide myself or withdraw a little bit more in order to heal from those things. And I think that in most ways I have done that. It still sneaks through at times. It still finds ways to kind of like hit me, but that's some of what comes with it. I think because living my life in this really kind of oversharing, like in the public eye, sharing these really personal comics, sharing so much of myself, pouring it into She-Ra and into my books, suddenly you can feel like a spotlight is hitting you. And so I made the decision to sort of like, while staying active in those spaces, trying to find a little bit more privacy in order to sort of like get my feet under me again and get my confidence back. And I have done that. I think that like, when it comes to the professional side, there are still moments that that anxiety gets to me, but yeah, I think that it has these weird sides to it as well, but at the same time, I do feel so lucky. I feel just boggled by the journey that I've had in the last few years, and just really, really grateful for all of it.
Awesome. So your books are marketed to children. I don't know if you start them as children's books or not, and that's part of this question. Nimona was a young adult. She-Ra, obviously a children's property. This Scarlet Morning is a middle grade novel, which is extremely readable for people of the older persuasion. So where does this, like, do you write for children when you're writing your books, or your comics, are you thinking of children? And then also, because this is really hard to do authentically, how do you write a child when you yourself are an adult? Like, that's a huge challenge right there. I just gave you a huge, big question.
I know. I'm like, yeah, I don't think I start any of these. I think She-Ra was probably the exception because the animation you really are, okay, this is for ages 6 to 11. So, but that's more about pitching it. That's more about going to an executive, someone who's gonna, help you sort of market and give you the money to make this actually happen. Personally, it's not really part of my process to come into it with like, I am aiming for someone exactly this age. And She-Ra, I think that like the 6 to 11, I don't know how thoroughly that applies. Like I certainly do meet a lot of like older fans of all ages. And with Nimona, I didn't see it as a YA novel at first. Like I swore a lot in the webcomic version, and there's a lot of blood. And then I'll see like 5-year-olds reading it, and they're like, yay, blood! And I'm like, okay. Like I'm always sort of surprised by the ways that it connects with people of different ages. With Scarlet Morning, again, like I think that it has a child's perspective because I literally did write it as a child. But then it was my editor being like, I see this as middle grade. And I was like, cool, I'm still gonna put a lot of blood in it because I like doing that. It's just, it's something that interests me, but I don't naturally gravitate towards certain things that would make it definitely like skew older. Like I don't really need, I would love to do an adult work one day. I want to figure out what that looks like for me, but I don't really need like sex or swearing. That's not like in the stories. It doesn't feel like I'm losing anything by not having those. But yeah, I do think, and I think it's probably true for a lot of us in comics, that my child self has kind of stayed with me through the years. When I was a kid, I saw myself as much older. I thought I was a full adult at 10, and I was just like swaggering into the CVS, and I'm like, 1 Dr. Pepper, please. And then, like I said, when I was 17, and I was like so ready to be gone, I was so ready to be out in the world, and then I was like, ah. And just, like hiding from landlords and not paying rent for like 3 months and then getting in trouble and being like, I'm sorry, I'm scared. And so sort of realizing that I wasn't ready in the ways that I thought I was. And now Scarlet Morning is from the point of view of children, and then it's all about the main character Viola, like looking at this older woman at Chase and being like, oh my God, like who are you? I want to be you. Like, what's your story? What's your mystery? Like, this sort of like obsessive, just trying to figure out what her deal is. And that's how I was as a kid, this sort of interest in the adults around me and being like, where are you going? Is it to get a divorce? And so this sort of heightened idea of like what an adult was. And so now, like, I was like, Chase, she's really old. She's so old. She's 35. And now I'm 34. And so it's something where I'm like, oh, now I'm relating to these adult characters that I was viewing through this like child lens of this very romanticized, very like, just this idea of how adults saw the world. And so it has ended up kind of being this meeting of the minds between my older and younger self, and sort of like, I feel like I relate more to the child characters now than I did at that age. But yeah, I think I always sort of kept that part of me alive. And in Nimona, like almost the whole final act, Nimona is stuck in the body of a 6-year-old. And she's her, like she has all her memories and everything, and yet she's sort of trapped as this younger person. And I feel like that myself sometimes, like that can kind of come into play or come out of nowhere. It just has felt, I don't know, yeah, I think that like comics, I think a lot of people in comics and in storytelling in general would say something similar as well. I think that other self, especially for queer people, I think it sticks around.
Yeah, I mean, and so, because I think people change a lot between 17 and 24, 30, 34, I'm just like, my daughter's 33, so I'm just freaking out here. When you look back at Nimona, like, even though that was a fully completed and well-rounded work, do you look back at it and do you see, I don't know, the naivete of a younger person, say? Do you think that, like, in 20 years you'll look back at Scarlet Morning? Probably not so much, actually. But, like, to look back at your work when you've been doing it as you're going through all the formative stages of your life, like, how do you feel about that? Tough question.
Yeah, I didn't reread Nimona, I think, for close to 10 years. I think I reread it before the movie came out. Mm-hmm. But it was the kind of thing, I am in this place with Scarlet Morning right now. I'm like, the book is closed, and I'm not opening it again for a second. I will see a thing. Actually, it's already happened. I've already spotted the typo, and if you see it, don't tell me. Pretend you didn't see it. But
I'm a copy editor, and I haven't found it. So.
Okay. It's the kind of thing where it's just like, it is done. It is out in the world. I need to let it be that. Now it's in y'all's hands, and it's going to be a second before I can kind of be neutral enough to come back to it and see it the way it is, instead of in the ways like, oh, I wish I could have done that better. But I had that period with Nimona as well. And so sitting down to read it again, I was really surprised. And I was surprised by, I was kind of like boggled by like how there were things that I saw myself working through on the page that I didn't realize, well, I wasn't aware of. The obvious one is that I was not out as trans, and I was writing a graphic novel about a shapeshifter, and those two things never, like, until like years later, and
the author is always the last to know.
I was doing the Nimona press tour, and like everyone, the directors and the producers are like, so obviously this is like an allegory about being trans. I'm like, is it? Okay, if you say so. So getting back into it and being like, oh, and now I have gone to therapy. Like, now I do. I'm like, oh, I see myself working through it right here. And I feel like it would be 5 more years before I was able to put that into words. But I was able to say that in comics so much sooner. And in some ways, it's really mysterious to me. Like, I don't really remember what it took to make it. It is this sort of like, the neutrality that has come with time. I'm like, wow, like, I don't know. I don't know how I did it in a lot of ways. So in some ways that's cool because I do get to kind of like experience it as a reader again. But yeah, I think that it is so much of, like I said, that feeling of working through things on the page, of sort of like going forward with them, both as a shield, but also as something that is very very vulnerable, very tender, very prone to bleed, and kind of like following that. That is how I make work. And I think it's the viewer, it's the reader, that it's how I know I'm real. You know, sort of the way that a sound doesn't become a sound until it, you know, interacts with someone's ear, the inner workings of their ear. Like, that's sort of how I feel about certain aspects of myself. And as I get older, I try to find, that's what I meant earlier about trying to find myself in privacy, you know, behind the scenes, not just in the validation that I get from other people. But it has always been like, and for as long as I can remember, it's always been the way that I have dealt with a broken heart. Of just like, okay, like I can't deal with it. I am going to go and I'm going to pour this emotion into a character and I'm going to explore it from their point of view. So yeah, like I said, I think I was like a little like, you know, when the guy I had a crush on who I'd never even talked to, like when I got my heart broken, I'd go home and I'm like, all right, this character's going through a divorce. And like, that was my way of taking that hurt and putting it outside of my body and kind of putting it under a microscope and working through it in that way.
That's how you process things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I understand, despite the fact that you're not rereading it at the moment, that Scarlet Morning is going to be a duology. So there's another volume coming. Is that part of the original work, and how will it relate to the first book?
Yeah, so like I said, the original draft was 600 pages, and when I signed the contract with HarperCollins, I was like, I'll cut it down. Definitely, I'll cut it down. And I did. I actually cut it down to 500 pages. And so I was like,
I've worked with authors like you as an editor.
Yeah. But like, they're so nice to me, and they're so supportive, and so I was like, can I do this as 2 books? And they said yes. And I'm so grateful for that. Because like I said, I just think that this story, it feels like there are certain things about it that make it what it is. And part of that is like the amount of time that you get to experience this world, like the feeling of the passage of time, all of those things. I felt like I needed that in order for it to play out the way that I saw it and the way that I remembered it. So yeah, so I am deep in the weeds for the next book, and of course it keeps getting longer and longer. But I am so grateful for their support. I'm so grateful that they're letting me, you know, that they're trusting me and what I feel this book needs to be. Yeah, so really excited for y'all to read book 2. It is like there's a lot. Yeah, there's just a lot, and I'm like, why has no one read the next book? Because I still have to write it. So I'm doing it as fast as I can.
Yeah. It does seem like, honestly, with fantasy, like the big fat book is something that kind of, you know, it fits with that kind of storytelling because there is so much to the world. And yet, actually, I have a question that, so I consulted with Robin Brenner. She was supposed to interview you the other day, and she had a great question that I pretty much cribbed from her. She knows a lot more about fantasy than I do. So finding out that the world is different than the way it was originally presented is a key to both Nimona and Scarlet Morning. The characters start out with one idea of good and bad, and they end up with another. And they learn to revise their beliefs. How were you already aware of that? Like, were you already thinking the world is bogus when you were writing Scarlet Morning? Like, there is something very scary about that when you realize, and you've talked about this already, like, the world is not like the grown-ups said it would be. It's not all that simple, you know. Why does that interest you as the type of story to tell?
I think it definitely is because that has been the way that I've experienced the world. I think that it's very hard, unless you've gone through a similar shift, to realize just how completely it changes your perception of even just the everyday way you interact with the world. Like I said, having a literal being being always present in my thoughts, going through the process of excising that and following my own feelings of right and wrong, and trying to truly for myself look at the world and discern what I think is most likely right. unless you've gone through a shift like that. And I was so deep in it, like it was something from a young age. I remember being 6 years old and breaking down in front of my parents because I knew even then that I didn't believe in God. And I was sobbing. I'm like, what do I do? What do I do? How do I make this happen? How do I want to do it. I'm here. I want it. Why is it not happening? And so, for many, many years, every single week and then every single day, it was just part of my prayers, and these same prayers that I'd say every single day. And then if you haven't yet, come into my heart, one of these days it's going to work. And so that was something that was just, I was always terrified of actually coming to terms with what that meant, and actually terrified of looking at it, terrified of that being true. And I was also terrified that everyone around me already knew that about me. I mean, I think that everyone knew something was going on. I was 15 with a buzz cut, and everyone was like, okay, sure, march to the beat of your own drum. And but I didn't, I didn't want that to be true. I wanted to be a sheep in the fold, and some part of me always knew I wasn't. And so that's what, I think that's more the Ballister character in Nimona, of sort of someone who has been cast out, and someone who is kind of because of who I am, because of the way I look, because of my disability, because of the person that I love, I have already been branded the villain. And while my counterpart, who is this, blonde, handsome, larger-than-life figure, he gets to be branded the hero, even though he's kind of the farthest thing from it. And that was so much, that felt, to me, the way that they'll look at someone and just be like, no, I know what you really are, and that thing is evil, and there's only so much you can do to counteract that. I think that story has always, even before I knew that was the story I was telling, like I said, the first draft of Scarlet Morning was written prior to my exodus from the church. But even then, in that, the idea that there's more than what they're telling us, pirates are not who they say they are. They are not these evil monsters who suck blood and gnaw on bones. These are people who they've been pushed to the outskirts of society, and they're doing the best they can to scratch out a life. And they're kind of thriving while doing it, Even, again, the obvious nature of, one of my friends read an early draft, and he's like, okay, so pirates as a metaphor for queerness, of course. And I was like, wait. Really? And there's a part in the book where they even... talking about the ways that pirates don't get to write their own history. It's other people from the outside sensationalizing them and talking about these larger than life characters, and instead they sing songs. And that's how they pass on their stories. And years later, even though you don't know who wrote that song, even though you don't know why, you still remember that song. And so that, it did become a way, as I was watching the doors get slammed in animation and the rug pulled beneath queer storytelling, and watching the way, I think that She-Ra, I don't know what's going to happen, but it has happened with several Netflix shows already that they've been removed and there's no way to legally obtain them anymore. I don't know what will happen. It is possible that everything we did will get harder to find and harder to watch. And so just knowing and seeing myself as part of history and seeing how this has happened before in the past, how do we try to write down our own histories and make sure they don't die out? And I don't really know the answer, but I'm trying to write those songs.
I think that's a really, really important point. And I also think if you look 50 years, 100 years from now, it's going to be exactly the opposite, where people will be dragging out old scratchy prints of She-Ra and going, this was great. So in your comic about making Scarlet Morning, one of the things that you mentioned is that somehow being in a creative writing course killed your desire to write. It sounded like there were categories that weren't working. So just, and I think this is something that young people need to hear too. What was wrong with that, and how did you ultimately manage to emerge and become a writer anyway?
Yeah, when I went to art school, I was an illustration major and a creative writing minor. And I was just I still had this book, and I was like, this is how I'm gonna, hone my craft and find an editor, all this stuff. And I ended up, there was one teacher in particular who just like, his big thing was the next great American novel. I heard that, so I'm guessing some of y'all might have had a similar creative writing professor. But it was something that, the kind of the levity, the lightness and the delight and the eagerness that I had approached writing with as a teenager, as a child, that started to get kind of squeezed out of me because I was trying to write important stuff. And I felt even like fantasy was something that he was not okay with. And so I was trying to, I was 17, I had barely lived at all, and I was trying to draw on my life and tell these hard-hitting, important narratives, and coming up empty and just feeling like an empty person with nothing to say. And this was part of the shift, I think, that was going on at the time, of just being like, who am I kidding? Who am I trying to be? And so I ended up dropping out of my creative writing minor, just being like, I'm not cut out for this. This is not me. I'm clearly, I thought I could write, and I was wrong. And so it was only getting into comics that kind of that showed me I was a writer. And it was only because that I could trick myself into pretending I wasn't a writer because I was drawing it. And then that led me to writing work in entertainment and in comics. But yeah, it was something that I had convinced myself that was just not gonna happen, and that I wasn't any good at it. And so it was really just comics was the way that I found that lightness again, because it's so hard to write even when you are writing about deep and heavy themes and pulling on painful events of your own life. You still have to find that clip and that thing that makes it pour out of you, even though writing is very rarely it pours out of you at all, but it's still the quickest way to kill your passion is to try to write like someone else, and to try to be the person in your head that you think is good at writing. It just doesn't work that way. And so I'm really glad that I did find a way to keep that voice alive as a writer. But yeah, it took comics, I think, to kind of actually hone that craft and find my own voice.
So you kind of grew up in a time that I regard as the great drought, when there weren't a lot of comics out there outside of newspaper comics. And you also had a fairly constricted childhood. What did you read comics as a child, or were you just more books and movies? And when did you discover comics?
So prior to 10 or 12 maybe, my parents did kind of relax a little bit as I got older, and then when I left for college, I literally came back that Thanksgiving and they were smoking weed around the fire pit, and I was like, what happened? Who are you people? And so it was this very yeah, before the age, I probably maybe more 11. I didn't even have movies, really. Any media that I was allowed to engage with was really, really restricted. So there wasn't a lot of comics. There was Calvin and Hobbes and newspaper funnies. And I was aware of superheroes. I knew I liked superheroes. I'd go with my dad to see Spider-Man and stuff, but it was not something that I really understood at all. Much less considered myself to be an aficionado of. So that was why it was so surprising when I did end up in comics. But it just happened to be when I was in school, I never saw it as a great drought. It's really interesting for you to describe it that way, because maybe that was prior to the 2010s, but then I had the privilege of standing on the shoulder of giants when it came to this webcomics renaissance, this golden age. That it was just the most exciting thing in the world. In the early days of Twitter, and just being an art student and Chen Hands, admiring Kate Beaton and Tony Cliff and my idols and these people, and I'm like, oh my God, these glamorous cartoonists, what are their lives like? And so, getting to come to my first conventions and rub elbows with my idols, it seemed to me like this cornucopia of just excitement. So I do think that I was drawing comics as a kid without knowing that's what they were. I would draw sequential art and like separate them by this vertical line. So it was really interesting seeing that and being like, I was inventing my own. This is what, like, you know, like people have been making sequential art for all of human history. We've just like found different visual language to actually tell that same, express those same ideas. So yeah, like even as a kid without a comics influence, like I do think that that's been part of my artistic DNA. It was just like, that was how, you know, that was when I just had the privilege of entering into something at that time in art school, like being trained in that way.
You know, it's interesting because it really was kind of a unique time. I mean, you were doing the fan art online. People were looking online for artists. I remember people coming up to me and saying, you know, do you know any artists who can do this? And I'd be like, wow, look at this one and this one. You know, because just it was easily discoverable. But at the same time, yeah, there had not been a lot of comics outside of superheroes up until that time. And you did, in fact, you wrote a Thor comic. What was that like?
I forgot about that until you said it.
That's why we do our research.
Yeah, that was, yeah, I did a couple. So I like illustrated a Wonder Woman comic with my friend James. I did a really short, very weird, like, Runaways comic that wasn't really Runaways. It was like different characters. And they were like, we decided to call it Runaways. And I was like, oh, okay, sure. So it was sort of this time where, you know, they were looking at more webcomics talent and kind of like inviting us to do these one-shots, which was really fun and exciting. Yeah, I felt like I enjoy writing comics. I enjoyed writing Lumberjanes. I do prefer to kind of do both the art and the writing myself, but it was really fun getting to work with someone whose visual language is different than mine. It was a really cool experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and talk a little bit, we have a couple minutes left, about Lumberjanes. Like, how did you get involved in that, and what did you take out of it?
So I interned for Boom in 2012, and I just was like, you know, really annoying, just always like in the background of every meeting, just like, ooh, what are you doing? Can I help? Can I go with you? Like, what's going on? Like, just so eager to like see the behind of the scenes of comics, and so that was sort of when Grace and Shannon, they came up with the idea for Lumberjanes, and then Shannon reached out to me and asked me to do some character designs to start finding out who these characters were. So the design of the characters, I did the first version of those before Gus, the artist, kind of brought his amazing genius art style to it and put his own spin on them. But yeah, it was this like sort of slow building of that team, and so they asked me to come on after those character designs to co-write with Grace, and eventually with Shannon. And so it was really just this like kind of meeting of the minds, this like Nick Fury Avengers moment. And yeah, it was just kind of like this like lightning in a bottle moment where I don't think any of us realized how big it was going to get, and how much it would kind of take off and we'd be chasing it. So, but yeah, that's how it started. It was really, I was so honored to be brought on and to like kind of lend my voice to that world. And yeah, it was great. I'm really, really fond of those stories.
Cool. And those Lumberjanes, I mean, there was like a very talented group of people who have kind of like, it's the Lumberjanes
yeah,
alumni.
It's like a who's who of like comics, yeah.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So, obviously you've got a big book to write. What other sorts of comics are you thinking about? Are you going to continue doing your slice of life? Do you have another fantasy epic lined up? Perhaps there'll be a superhero comic or a murder mystery in your, like, what's going on here? What's next?
So Scarlet Morning, book 2, is everything on my horizon at the moment. All of the, the follow-up drafts, the illustrations, and then I do have a new story that's been kind of simmering in my head, and I tried to write this in my dream, like the night before last night, like here. And in my head, I was like trying to write it all down. I'm like, this is genius. And I woke up, and I don't remember most of it, but I do remember a little bit. It's kind of like based on my, it has actually, and God willing, you will read this one day, but it has very little to do with this literally, but I love reading about mountaineering disasters. I'm really, really fascinated by mountains. And like I said, these places that human beings keep trying to go that don't want us there. And so the idea of like kind of the death zone on these mountains and the way that like you venture into them and your body just starts shutting down. And the longer you stay, the more you die. And so, yeah, that was something that I was just like, wait, like, I think I know how to crack this other story that's been kind of simmering in my head, and maybe I can combine those two ideas. So that's all I'll say for now. Who knows what other, how it will evolve as time goes on. But yeah, there are other stories that I'm really excited to tackle.
Oh, good. Oh, good. You're reminding me of the time, never do this. I watched a movie about Mount Everest with a bunch of physicists. They were all discussing how everybody would die.
I've watched a lot of movies about people who like die or almost die on mountains. I'm just like, it's the kind of thing that I think I'm like, I will never climb a mountain.
I was going to say, have you ever climbed a mountain?
No, this is why I have to watch the videos to remind myself why I should never try to do this.
What about going on a ship?
I also probably shouldn't do that.
You know, you're a great interview because, like, all my questions, you just kind of transition from one to another without me actually having to ask them. So
I just love to yap. It's easy for me.
Yes, but now you have a big audience for it. So we'll just like drop in a couple general things while we still have the time, which is like, what do you think? And this is actually a good question. Where do you think comics is going? You can answer that in 30 seconds, right?
Oh, yeah,
Define
just a
the
little,
universe and
just
give
a
3
small
examples.
tidbit.
Yeah, I mean, and you've been a part of this huge change in comics that's happened over the past, like, since 2010, really. How do you see comics evolving? Like, are you thinking about doing floppy comics? Do you think that web comics are going to come back in force? What interests you in comics? Let me put it that way. What interests you right now in the world of comics? And you can even, if there's something that you're reading that you like, you can, talk about that.
Yeah, that is a really, really big question. And I think for me, for those of us who are sort of maybe in the second chapter of their career, of sort of more of, not bursting onto the scene with all the things we want to say, but more being like, where am I? What's my context among the emerging voices of comics? And I try to adapt more of a Scott McCloud outlook on things, of that interest, of the kind of like, trying to pay attention, trying to follow people and see where they lead, because I don't think that I don't think I have that full perspective. I didn't as a very young artist either, but I thought I did. And that's one of the great things about being, like, making your first works, because it does seem like the most obvious thing in the world. You only know the environment that you emerge onto. And so it's sort of easy to respond to that, or more easy before, you start to kind of see things change over like the more than 10 years now that I've been in this industry. But I think that I am torn at the moment between, as many of us are, a sort of like, we're thinking more about where we came up from. We're thinking about this nostalgia and this history that we all carry, and then also looking to a future that is more uncertain than it's ever been, that is going through these upheavals that are pretty unprecedented, especially, well, in pretty much every conceivable way, in almost every industry, but in the arts especially, and with the rise of this AI bubble. And so it is, I think, that what interests me at the moment is a return to, the first word that comes to mind is ugliness. And that's not really what I mean, but it is something that resists the gloss and polish that algorithms tend to apply. So I am more interested in, I don't even know if they'll look like the Xerox copies of the past, of underground comics, because those are in the past. I think they will be, whatever comes next, it is going to be something we've never seen before. And I think it's easy to get really scared about that. It's scared being uncertain, like it's scary being uncertain, but also it's exciting. I think that what happens is going to be, the word that I just keep landing on is remarkable, because remarkable is, it doesn't just mean amazing, brilliant, we'll all have everything, and it will be like, again, this surplus, this everyone will have a job, everyone will get paid their due, everyone will have their voice heard. I hope that's true. I do think that it is going to be something like we've never seen, and I think that has the potential to be like just so remarkable. And I am so excited to see what that is. And I think that it is going to be like, for the people in this room who are just now finding their voice, who are putting out their first work, like, It's you. No pressure. But like also like it is like this world is going to be defined by everyone in this room. And I think I am eager more than anything, both to be a part of this, but also to see where it goes. And just trying to keep an open mind to all of that instead of being scared, instead of being like, back in my day, we did it this way. It's like, no, we did it this way. It's important to know those things. It's important to know where we came from. And then also just, you know, looking to a future, even when it's like strange and ugly and weird, and finding beauty in that. I think with Scarlet Morning, it's an apocalypse story, but it's also one of finding, like, this is what we have. This is what we're living with. Let's find the beauty in it. Let's find what to embrace. A thing that, like, for the first time in our lifetimes, we have this thing that shouldn't be happening, but also that has brought with it something that we can use, something that can be ours, that we can claim. And so, yeah, I challenge both myself and everyone here to find those times to embrace things that might otherwise be scary and weird, and adopt the things that aren't so polished, that aren't so, you know, beloved by algorithms, that a computer thinks it can make and it can't. The things that just make us and human and alive. I'm really excited to see what those things are.
Wow. And I want to bring this back to something very concrete, which is the way that you draw. Or not. I'm sorry. I'm getting the we have to stop now. So obviously we'll have to do this again next year.
Yes.
So thank you. So thank you very much
Thank
for
you so
everything.
much.
And thank you for being such a great audience.
These questions were so amazing. Thank you for our interpreters.
Yes,
thank you all for being here. This was so much fun.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. We have Nate Stevenson signing his new book right outside. You can grab signing tickets right in line. Our volunteers will direct you to where the line starts. Books will also be available for purchase.